Hello, my name is Imelda Doyle, and I'm prompted to tell you my story because my story is a story of redemption, and my wish is that if you haven't already started a healing journey, that you might be prompted to do so or continue on one you're already on. My story begins in 1966 in Ireland, and I am in a home for unmarried mothers and their babies. I am just beginning to have birth pains. And for some reason, and I think it was by design, I'm separated from everybody else in the home. And my memory particularly is of being in the garden and walking around alone. It wasn't so much the pain at that stage as the feeling of isolation, of being removed from the presence of everybody else. And also because it was my first time to give birth, I was experiencing huge fear and anxiety. And that lack of a comforting arm or a kind word, I really felt acutely. At 9 p.m. that night, I went across the grounds to the small hospital of the home, which was a separate building from the main house. And again, I remember the feeling of loneliness and isolation. And with every contraction, the mounting fear and anxiety. It was early December, and I was walking across the grounds in the dark on my own. I arrived at the hospital, and I was met by a woman who I would have described at the time as an older woman, but I was in my early 20s, so she could have been 40. She didn't greet me by name. She didn't speak to me. She let me in and she took me to a room. She switched on the light. She instructed me to lie on a high, narrow bed. And then she switched out the light and left. And I remember listening to her heels, the sound of her heels tipping on the floor, receding down the corridor away from me. Well, I couldn't even begin, I think, to describe the fear, the terror, and the anxiety that overtook me. It was actually like, when I think about it now, in my memory, it was like a dark blanket had descended on me, and it was reaching into every crevice of my being, my physical body, my mind, my heart and soul. So there was only one thing I could do. So at some point, I'm on the ceiling. I've left my body, and I'm looking down at my physical body lying on this high, narrow bed. And I remember thinking that I looked like a beached whale. The next thing I remember about that night wasn't until the next morning, when this woman who had brought me in the night before was with me, and she was shouting at somebody else, "Go quick, get Sister Elizabeth. It's 7:30. This was 7:30 a.m. And she will just be coming out of Mass. Go now, don't delay." The next sound I'm aware of is Sister Elizabeth coming down the corridor towards where I was. I could hear the swish, swish, swish of her long skirts and the clickety-clack of her rosary beads against her body as she walked. The next thing I remember is that I am looking at what at first I thought was a doll lying on a worktop over to my right. And then I realized it wasn't a doll, that it was a baby, and that the baby was dead. And then Sister Elizabeth's voice telling me that my baby was dead. No explanation was given for why she died or what happened. But looking back now, the nurse was probably having a sleep or a cup of tea or knitting. I was on the ceiling. So if she got into difficulty, there was no one there to help her. A lot is talked now about the life of the baby inside the womb. And I sometimes have the idea that in that process, she just said, do you know what? I ain't going out into this world. I'm getting off the train here. Bye-bye. I'm gone. I don't remember too much about what happened next. Obviously, I probably slept because I must have been very tired after the night. My next memory is that I'm still in the hospital, and it seems like 2 or 3 days after the birth of my daughter. And a nurse told me that one of the women I was very friendly with in the home had had her baby and she wanted to see me. And this woman, I'll call her Frances, she had a slight physical deformity, and she had spoken often about her concern that because if the baby had this physical deformity, that it wouldn't be eligible for adoption. When I went in to see her, her poor face was red and swollen from crying. She was so upset. Her baby had the same slight physical deformity. I can't remember what I said to her. I probably said something like, it'll be all okay, which was a lie, or at least I didn't know it would all be okay. I probably gave her a hug. In my memory now, what concerns me and sometimes upsets me is the fact that during such time of distress, the only one it seemed that Frances had to put an arm around her or extend a kind word to her was me, who had just been to hell and back a couple of days earlier. There was no compassion, there was no kindness, there was nobody ever to put an arm around you. I don't really remember much about where I spent my time after the birth of my baby. I didn't go back to the big house because I didn't see any of the women I was friendly with again. I had this idea for years that I stayed in the hospital, but I have no memory of being in the hospital, and I feel that if I was there, I would have heard other women coming and going, giving birth. What I do remember was that when I was in the big house and I was in the dormitory, I woke up one night and the head of my bed was to a wall, so I was looking out over the entire dormitory. And I saw a very tall woman at the far end beginning to walk towards me. And as she walked, she looked from side to side at the woman in each bed. I realized that I could only see her body from the top of her head to underneath her belly, her pregnant belly, that she was supporting with her hands, and that she was in an oval of light. And so my instinct was that she wasn't of this world. And as she got closer to me, I dived under the covers. I lay there sweating profusely until I don't know how much time had passed when I heard somebody get up and go to the toilet. And because there was no reaction, I felt it was safe for me to come up from under the covers. I often think about her. I often wondered why she was walking there. Maybe her soul was trapped there, or maybe she was coming to warn me about what was my fate. One memory I do have is that after my baby was born, I was put to work in a nursery where there was quite a large number of children from babies up to around the age of 4. And a lay nurse who worked there with me, and I find this interesting because the woman who admitted me to the hospital that night was also a lay nurse. And she said to me one day, "You must have interfered with your baby when you were pregnant." By interfered, she meant that I would have attempted abortion, which would have been completely prohibitive in Irish society at that time, and would be seen as a very bad, if you like, thing to do, a sinful thing to do. I didn't respond to her because somehow I didn't feel I had a voice in the situation I was in. But there was the realization that her estimation of me was so low that anything or any kind of badness that she could conceive of in her mind could be attributed to me. My time came to leave the home, and at this time it was just coming up to Christmas. My daughter had been born on the 6th of December, and in my memory, this was just the Thursday or Friday before Christmas. Christmas fell at the weekend that year, 1966. My sister came to the home to collect me, and we got the bus into the centre of the city. Our plan was to go to Cleary's, and I wanted to buy a new coat. I was returning to my family in rural Ireland for the Christmas holiday, and my parents or my younger siblings didn't know that I had been in that home and had a baby. As far as my parents were concerned and the rest of the family, I was returning home from working in England. I remember walking down O'Connell Street, and remember I had been virtually in prison for 3 months. So the noise and the sounds of the city just exploded inside my head. My brain couldn't cope with everything that was coming in through my ears, the noise of the traffic, people talking, and also the proximity of people to me walking this way and that way. However, my sister and I went to Cleary's, a famous store in Dublin city centre and a great landmark, and I bought a coat. I can still see that coat. It was a wool crepe coat in a kind of a tealy blue. A pair of Dr. Zhivago style boots and a furry hat, because it was 1966 after all, and the Dr. Zhivago look was the look of the moment. So here I was, I had my disguise, and I was ready to go home and be with my family for Christmas. But what I'd actually done wasn't just buy a coat. What I'd actually done was I had put on a disguise and I had abandoned that young woman who had been through that ordeal in that home. My one standout memory from being at home that Christmas was sitting round the fire with my parents and my younger siblings. And I thought I was actually going to fall off the chair and into the fire. I felt in a total state of collapse. I felt unable to function in the world, really. When I was a teenager growing up in 1950s Ireland, we were told the story that if you French kissed with a boy, you'd get pregnant. Now, I'm not even sure that I knew what French kissing meant. Certainly, birth control of any kind wasn't allowed. What you couldn't purchase in Ireland, it wasn't obtainable. And condoms were referred to as French letters, so the French were getting very bad press here. But I think that the French kissing was the kissing with tongues. And I suppose the real warning was that if you allowed yourself to get to that state of passion with a boy, you might just go the whole hog and have sexual intercourse. And that was totally forbidden. The social stigma around sex and pregnancy outside of marriage was huge. And the judgment and the disgrace placed upon you was enormous as well. So when I became pregnant, when I realized I was pregnant, I did what a lot of other Irish people did in times of trouble. We went to England. So I went to England. I knew somebody living in Birmingham, and I went to stay with her. And I got a job there, and I worked there during my pregnancy. And there was no judgment there. At least I wasn't aware of any judgment on me. I was just another member of the staff. The manageress where I worked was very kind to me, and she assured me that if I wanted to return after the birth of my baby, my job would be there for me. And that's what I did. I went back to my job in Birmingham in January 1967. It's July 1967 and I am home from my job in Birmingham. I am standing with a large group of people, my parents, my siblings, relatives, neighbours, friends, around a large hole in the ground. And that is the grave that's awaiting the coffin that holds the remains of my 27-year-old brother who had just died suddenly from a brain hemorrhage. There's a heaviness in the atmosphere. It's as if the light has gone and the earth and the world is upside down, and it's like the earth is descending like a cloud down between us, dropping in around everyone, wrapping its arms around everybody. Everybody is crying, sobbing. My sister is sobbing uncontrollably. But in the midst of it all, in a moment, I see myself and I am standing quite stoic. I'm not crying. I don't appear to be feeling any emotion. I don't feel any emotion inside myself. Suddenly, like I went into an altered state of consciousness, I see myself on my hands and knees on the ground, screaming, howling, roaring. And in an instant, it's gone again, and I'm back standing by the graveside. And I did forget. I forgot the day I walked out of that home and down to Cleary's and reinvented myself in some way. I had abandoned myself. I had pushed the memory of that experience down so far into my psyche that it was like there was no trace of it anywhere. What I didn't realise was that it was lodged in my body. I never went back to my job in Birmingham. I went to live with my sister, Sheila, and her husband and family, and I got a job locally. But life was becoming really difficult and my life was falling apart, really. I wasn't taking care of myself in the way I always had. I'd always been interested in clothes and fashion. I wasn't bothering about how I looked. I wasn't doing things like washing my hair frequently enough. I wasn't able to sleep at night. And I was awake until the small hours reading, so I was very tired. And then eventually I couldn't even read at night. And when I did sleep, I was having these really dark dreams of walking along streets filled with mud and having to lift my legs really high to take a step. And the buildings around me were very tall, not typical of buildings you would have seen in Ireland at that time. And everything was grey. I was also having headaches every day, every night. Now, I'd always had migraines since childhood, but these were constant headaches. They weren't migraine headaches. I was going into the city centre to a small chemist, no longer there, and I was buying generic bottles of generic codeine, and I was taking them for headaches. Of course, I didn't realise then the implication of taking codeine. One night when things got really, really bad and I couldn't sleep and I think I just felt lost. I don't actually remember how I felt exactly, but I decided I was going to take my own life. And I overdosed on whatever codeine I had. Fortunately or unfortunately, the effect was that it made me nauseous and I went into the bathroom to throw up. And my sister heard me. And she came in and she said, "What have you done?" And I told her. So she got an ambulance and took me to hospital. And they pumped out my stomach. I don't know what I told them or if I told them anything other than I had taken the codeine or if she had told them anything. But they transferred me to the psychiatric hospital, St. Lomans. And now it could have been some hours since I was admitted to the first hospital, and this could have been 8 or 9 in the morning. And so there was a psychiatrist and a nurse there. And I don't know what the psychiatrist said to me, but I do remember very clearly hitting him very hard across the face. The next thing I knew, there's a needle in my arm and I'm knocked out. And for the following 2 weeks, I'm living in some kind of dream world. As I awoke and was moving around the hospital and spending the days in the day room with other patients, my body was in tremors, and it turned out that I was having an allergic reaction to the drugs I was on. So I had a chat with my psychiatrist, and he said, I will take you off medication completely if you promise to behave yourself. And I said I would. I eventually left the hospital and got a job and went back and pursued some kind of normal life. What strikes me now, looking back at that time, is that nobody ever asked me, what happened to you? And a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I was listening to Gabor Mate speaking, and he said, and I hope he doesn't mind me quoting him, he said to the audience, who in the audience, who put up your hand if you've been to an ologist? And a number of people put up their hands. And then he said, put up your hand if that ologist asked you what happened to you. And one person put up their hand. So we still don't ask often enough, what has happened to you? What has resulted in this kind of behavior in you? So my life returned to what you might consider normal. Work, family, friends, whatever, relationships. The birth of my son, Paul, was another landmark in my life. And I want to tell you about that because the comparison between the birth of my daughter and his birth was just, the difference in bringing him into the world was just phenomenal. I was in the National Maternity Hospital. Around lunchtime of that day, he was born on a Thursday. I'm lying in the bed I'm in a labour ward, there are other women there. And I hear somebody on the phone saying, I wonder if you could come up because I have a woman here and she's getting very anxious and almost terrified. And I don't seem to be able to calm her down. And I think maybe if you came and sat with her and talked to her, she might be okay. I didn't realise she was talking about me until this beautiful young woman arrived by my side, held my hand, talked me through my breathing, gave me gas and air, and stayed with me for about the final 3 hours of my labour. My baby boy's body slipped beautifully into the world. He was wrapped in a blanket by a young man and handed to me, who said, isn't he beautiful? And he was indeed. There wasn't a mark of any kind of stress or anxiety on his little face. He was a gift to me at that time in my life and still remains so. One of the soundtracks to my life growing up as a child was the sound of my mother's sewing machine as she made all our clothes. I remember standing by her and watching her as she would guide the fabric through the machine and turn the handle with her right hand. When I was 9, I got a gift of a girl doll. Up to that time, I'd only ever seen a baby doll, but this was a girl doll. It had come from America and it was probably a precursor to the very popular Barbie of today. But my girl doll was totally naked. And so that summer, I was 9. I spent the entire summer sitting outside in the sun, making clothes for her from my mother's rag bag. And I think that was the beginning for me of a career in dressmaking and sewing and an interest in fashion and fabrics. So while Paul was still young, but going to playgroup for a couple of hours every morning, and I was home alone, I began to do alterations for people. People knew that I sewed, so they would come to me to shorten their trousers or replace a zip or whatever. And one day I wasn't charging. And one day I said to myself, I should be charging these people. And if I charged them, they'd stop giving me so much sewing. But in fact, the opposite was true. Once I start charging them, they now realized they were in a professional situation with me. So they asked me to sew as much as they wanted. So I began a dressmaking business from home. However, I realized that I had no professional training. And I think the big stumbling block for me was being able to alter patterns. So I went to the Grafton Academy to study pattern making. I wasn't really interested in learning how to sew or learning how to design. I just wanted the purely functional skills of knowing how patterns were constructed so that I could alter them. In the midst of all this, I was a heavy smoker, and I suffered every winter with chest infections and bronchitis, until eventually my doctor said to me, "I'm not treating you anymore unless you stop smoking. There's no point. It's just throwing stuff down a black hole." So in the process of trying to stop smoking, which was quite a struggle, I came across an article one day in a magazine about yoga. And it said that yoga was now being practiced widely in the West, and all the benefits of yoga, such as improved mental health, improved diet, improved lifestyle. But the last sentence was the sentence that really caught me. And that was that yoga essentially is a spiritual practice. Now, I had been brought up, as most of my cohorts would be, in a Catholic Ireland, a very Catholic Ireland. And while I would say the church was important to us in our lives, my parents weren't overzealous, but we still obeyed the rules and did things like said the rosary every day. But I sang in the choir from the age of about 9 or 10. And I loved singing in the choir. And I loved the rituals of the church, particularly Easter, more so than Christmas. I mean, after all, Easter is the primary Christian feast because it is a testimony of our faith that Jesus was indeed God. One thing I remember about singing in the choir, that once during some hymn, I can't remember what it was, I had what I look back on now and realize that I went into an altered state of consciousness again. I found myself in this space that was vast and completely clear. There was no flashing lights. There was just this feeling of absolute calm and peace and quiet, like I had never experienced in my life. And then, as quickly as I went into it, on another note, I came out of it. But that experience stayed with me. And I think it was that created a longing in me, a yearning for some kind of connection with something greater than myself. Nevertheless, in spite of this yearning, I found myself departing from the Catholic Church in my late teens. It just didn't seem to me to express or help me to find a way of being with that presence, of being with that yearning. It just seemed there were too many rules and regulations that had to be adhered to, and no place to find the space, that silence that I had experienced in the singing in the choir, to find that God or spirit or whatever there was in the universe that was greater than all of us. Having read the piece about yoga and that essentially it was a spiritual practice, I think that was the piece that really got me, even though it had also said that people were stopping smoking and changing their diets and living better lives as a result of the practice. So I found myself a yoga teacher and I started yoga classes. I am now trying to emulate the woman at the top of the room who is making the most exquisite shapes with her body and apparently effortlessly. But they're not effortless for me. The struggle and the difficulty of coming into particularly my lower body was painful. However, I persisted. I started a daily practice. I got up before I started my work every day and did my practice. I went to my classes every week until eventually one day, the teacher at the top of the room said to me, "Imelda, would you consider training to be a yoga teacher?" I didn't say this out loud, but I thought, me, who was experiencing so much pain in comparison to what you're doing, apparently so effortlessly. But I said yes. And I think the reason she asked me was that she was aware of my commitment to the practice. And that was probably as a result of questions I'd asked her and conversations that I'd had with her about how it was changing my life, because I had in fact given up smoking and I had in fact changed my diet. Much to my son's disgust, I might say. He wasn't interested in healthy food. For all the reasons that I've stated and my reluctance to be in my body, the teacher training course was extraordinarily difficult physically for me. The meditation and relaxation I really enjoyed. And one day in meditation, our tutor, Malcolm, said at a moment when I, and anyway, was at a very still point, "Can you hear the still voice of God in the stillness?" The tears just rolled down my face. This was the first time I had ever been invited back into this space, and the first time that I realized that in meditation I could come, even if only for moments, that I could come back into that space. I also began to study the philosophy of yoga as part of the course, and to learn that the practice of yoga and the belief in yoga is based on a belief in reincarnation. And while that's not necessary, that belief is not necessary to practice it in the world today, because yoga is having its own evolution now in the West. But in studying the philosophy of yoga, I would learn that yoga had been practiced for thousands of years in India. And one story that I was told was that yoga at that time was only meditation, and that was the purpose of yoga, or as the word translates into English, union. And the union that the yogis were seeking was union with God. That made sense to me in a funny kind of way, in that I thought, and I still think, that you can't live your life ignoring God and then when you die rock up and say, "I'm here." Who are you? I've never heard of you. I haven't heard anything about you for years. So I think if we want to embrace that purpose in our life, we do need to establish a relationship with God. And I felt that then, and that was my point of encouragement at that, to continue practice, even though physically it was very difficult. These men were the scientists of their day. They would discover through meditation the chakras, the centers of consciousness in the physical body, and later in the development of asanas would develop a means of opening these chakras so that we could live fully conscious in our lives. As part of the teacher training course, we were invited to study a subject that would support this work of transcendence and transformation. I chose astrology. Now, astrology has had a bad press over the years, and it's been reduced to something of a party game. Let's have a look at our astrological predictions in this magazine, ha ha ha. But as the study of astrology is a very serious subject, and it is now thankfully having something of a rebirth. The natal astrological chart can show us very specific to us how and where the universal energy manifests through us, and so has that huge potential for guiding us. For instance, in the study of astrology, I discovered that when I had started my practice of yoga, I was on my first Saturn return. Now, Saturn, the planet Saturn, gets a bit of a bad press. Is usually associated with restriction and difficulty and death. But Saturn, in fact, offers us, when he returns to the place he was when we were born, he offers us an opportunity to in some way reset our lives. So even when I talk to people now and they tell me that something major happened to them, like when they were 28, a relationship broke up, they started a relationship, they left a career, they changed their career, they returned to study. These are all times when people reset their life. And so with my embarking on the study of yoga, I realized that I was resetting my life, that my life was going to be very different from now on. It was around this time that I had a dream. I dream I'm walking along a pathway, and on my left there's a waterway. I don't know whether it's a river or a canal. But the scene is very grey and it's like winter, and there are no leaves on the trees which are on the other side of the water from me. Suddenly in the dream, I'm in the water and I can't swim and I'm drowning. And I'm starting to struggle against drowning. When I had the thought, what would happen if I just let go? So I just let go and I felt myself relaxing back into the water. And when the water entered my mouth and my nostrils and into my lungs, it felt like air. Suddenly I'm out of the water and I'm over on my right-hand side, and I am standing at the base of a beautiful, ornate iron bridge, painted white. And it's arching over a landscape that is undulating hills of beautiful green colours, and those perfectly shaped trees that you sometimes see in Italian paintings, because you see them in Italy, are dotted around the landscape. And I begin to walk over this bridge. I'm at the very early stages of it, and I wake up. But I realise that in the first part of the dream, some part of me had died. And in the second part of the dream, I was standing at the foot of the bridge that would take me to transcendence or transformation. One evening on my way home with a friend, we decided to stop off at a pub for a drink. I'm driving and I'm in the car, stopped with my indicator on to turn right into the car park, when suddenly, wham, a rather large car, I can't describe exactly what it was, whacked into the back of me. My head went back, as did hers, and I could hear the bones in my neck crunching. Drove to the hospital, which wasn't very far away, x-rayed, nothing wrong, soft muscle tissue, a whiplash injury. A bit of damage done to the car, but that wasn't of any consequence to me at the time. About a week later, the headache started. Now, I had always suffered from migraine from childhood, but they're occasional headaches. These headaches started and they were daily headaches. They were a mixture of migraine and just headaches that were inexplicable to me, that I'd never experienced before. I remember around that time wakening in the middle of the small hours of the morning, the middle of the night, I suppose, and hearing a thunderstorm. I saw a flash of lightning, and I heard the clap of thunder. And I waited to hear it again or to see more lightning. And then I realized that there wasn't a thunderstorm, that the flash of light and the sound was in my head. I can't even begin to tell you how these headaches took over my life. I mean, they were constant. They were debilitating. It was very difficult to continue. A couple of times during those early years of me having the headaches, which I had for 25 years, I went on holiday once to America and had to book myself into a clinic because the headaches got so bad. And once in Spain with my sisters, and my sister took me and booked me into a clinic where they set me up on a saline drip because they said my body was completely dehydrated from vomiting. I'm unable to describe to you really the terror and the anxiety that accompanied these headaches, and the level of pain was excruciating. I was taking industrial quantities of over-the-counter medication with codeine, completely against the manufacturer's guidelines, I have to say. As the headaches went on, I became more and more tired and more unable to even live out the ordinary things of life. The lunches cancelled. I remember booking tickets for a concert for myself and a friend and telling her to take somebody else that I couldn't go. The neurologist diagnosed me with chronic migraine and chronic everyday headache. She prescribed triptans, which had just come on the market at that time. But triptans are for migraine, and migraines are occasional headaches. And so you can't take very many of them. If you were using them for regular migraines, you'd probably be taking maybe one or two a month. Whereas I needed something to relieve the headaches every day. And so I was taking this medication with codeine. The neurologist also said to me that they couldn't cure me, that I had a pain pattern in my brain, and that they were only beginning to find out about pain patterns. So I decided I couldn't live like this, and I contemplated taking my own life. And I had a couple of ideas for doing so, but I never followed through on them. Fortunately, when I was involved in the yoga and in the teacher training course, I had information about different forms of alternative healing that might help me. So the first person I went to see was a homeopath. I should say now at this point, sorry, before I talk about the homeopath, that I had had some acupuncture, but that didn't seem to work for me. So I went to see a homeopath, and she said, I'll take your case, because homeopathy is not just talking about the symptoms and how they're affecting you. It takes account of the whole person, of who you are, of what's going on in your life, what's gone on in your life. So she wanted to hear about my whole life, really. So I suppose I gave her something of an edited version. But at one point, I reached a pause, and I surprised myself by hearing my own voice telling her that I had been in one of those homes for unmarried mothers and had a baby who died. Now, I hadn't spoken about this to anyone, not even my sisters who knew about that for 35 years. I had pushed it down inside me. And whatever reaction I was expecting from her, or from anyone I might have said it to, I didn't get it. She just said, I'm sad to hear that. And we talked a little bit about that experience, and if I'd had a chance to name her. And so I explained that I didn't, that while the sisters in the home told me they had baptized her and called her Mary and had laid her out with candles and everything, I wasn't involved in any of that. So she said to me then, this pain is trying to tell you something. And maybe that's what it's trying to tell you, that you need to heal that in some way. She asked me if I was still doing physical yoga, and I said no, I wasn't, because I was too tired. My body was too tired. I just didn't have any energy for anything, only barely doing the things that were essential to staying alive. So she said she was aware of a meditative movement practice called the 5 rhythms, and that she felt that coming back into my body and doing some work in my physical body would really help me. I also told her, of course, about the industrial quantities of medication with codeine I was taking. And she said to me, well, of course, codeine is addictive and it's probably causing some of your headaches. And my doctor confirmed this, that codeine was probably causing some of my headaches. So was there any way I could see to coming off it? So what I decided after that was that I would take some time off. I was fortunate in that I had some savings, and I decided to take 3 months off, and that I would stop taking the codeine. Fortunately for me, she gave me a remedy. If she told me the name of it, I don't remember. The homeopath gave me a remedy. I can only tell you that I was glued to the sofa for about 10 days. I never went upstairs to bed. It was just like somebody had knocked me out. I wasn't knocked out mentally, or I don't know if I was there even emotionally. I just had no energy. I still had, of course, many, many headaches, and I was still taking the medication with codeine. But after those 10 days, one day I took the medication with codeine and it just didn't work. And even now, if I went out and bought that same medication, if I had a backache or a leg ache or any kind of an ache, it just wouldn't work for me. The pain would just still persist, like I had taken nothing. So whatever she had given me had moved me out of that space in my body. I can't describe how that would happen. I'd need to be a homeopath to be able to describe to you. But the codeine was now gone. Now, it wasn't easy because I was still in a lot of pain. So I was taking every painkiller known to man to try and survive that period. So in this state of not really being up to much at all, I decided to book into a workshop on the 5 rhythms and take her advice that might help me come into my body. So I went to my first workshop, and I have to say I really enjoyed it from the first moment. In the 5 rhythms, there are no steps to do. There's nothing to know. There's nothing to learn. The only requirement is to turn up, to be present, and to breathe, and to be in your body. Now, I won't say I came into my body, but that day in that first workshop, at some point, and I can't remember how this related to anything else in the workshop, she asked the group, as a group, for each of us to move across the floor and to move with our shame. So I'm on my belly. I am moving across the floor. I feel like a fat slug. I'm moving very slowly when I heard her voice saying, "It's painful to watch, isn't it?" And I looked up and everybody was standing at the other end of the room, and I was just about halfway across. And that was the moment I realized how crippling my shame was and how much it must have been affecting me in all areas of my life. Following that, I was fortunate in being able to sign up for an ongoing workshop, which was a series of 5 workshops, 1 rhythm each workshop, over a 15-month period. It was a closed group, so it was the potential for healing and nurturing was huge. Now, you might think I was on my way, but I wasn't, because I was on the run. I took off around that dance floor at 1,000 miles an hour. Flowing was quick, staccato was quick, chaos was quick, lyrical was quick, even stillness was quick. I just would not stop and breathe and come into my body. I mean, this was a very slow process for me. And probably I did a number of these workshops, but probably by the end of the first one, I was beginning to realize that I wasn't in my body, that I hadn't been there for as long as I could remember. Sometimes at those workshops, I would be so tired, I would actually lie on the floor, wrapped up in a rug. But I was always able to stay present to the noises from the group, to the music, to the instructions, because a lot of the instructions from the teacher were about going inside. And while they were related to the movements, somewhere inside me, those teachings still resonated. And so very slowly, I did start to come into my body. Again, I was fortunate in that I decided that I needed further help. I needed deeper help. And so I started seeing a psychotherapist. And that would be a huge change for me, for the better. The first time I saw her, I told her my story about Rachel, because I was fairly sure now that that was what was at the root of everything, that was something I had completely blocked out. I couldn't find anything else in my childhood. I trawled through my childhood, through my siblings, through my parents, but I couldn't find anything else that was suppressed or that I couldn't talk about or deal with. So I started to tell her my story about when my daughter was born. So I started, I was in a home, I got pregnant, I was in a home for unmarried mothers. I went to the hospital and she put me on a high bed, turned out the light, left me there all night. The next thing I remember, 7:30 in the morning, blah, 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 blah. And when I was finished, she said, "That's a story. You could have read that in a book or seen it in a film." She said, "It's just a story. There's nothing in the way you tell it to me that relates it to yourself." So she said, "How would you tell me that story if that happened to, say, your eldest granddaughter?" Well, I exploded. I'd kill somebody. I'd go to the ends of the earth to fight for her. I would be absolutely raging. I would be disgusted that she was neglected like that. And she leaned towards me and she said, "I wonder why you don't feel all that for yourself." And that was the start of me really getting into the emotions, the feelings, the fear, the terror, the vulnerability, and the idea of feeling abandoned and neglected. And that was huge for me, and accompanied feelings of not being good enough. We also talked about my addiction, and it was actually funny the way this arose, because I went to see her one day and I sat back in the chair and I said, "I want to tell you something," I said. "My purse is empty. There's no money in my bank account, and my credit card is maxed out." And she said, "Yeah, well, I think you do have something of a shopping addiction." And I said, "Oh no, not at all. I just love clothes. I mean, I get excited when I go into a shop and I see all the possibilities of putting things together. And, I never just buy a trousers. I always buy a top or maybe even a jacket or jewelry, because then everything is coordinated perfectly." She said, "I can hear in your voice how something's changed inside you when you're telling me that." So she said, could I ask you, would you act that out for me? Act out what it's like for you when you're in a clothes shop. Think about some time recently when you were in a clothes shop. So I did. And I couldn't believe it myself. I mean, she said to me, do I need to tell you? I said, no, I'm not in my body. I'm somewhere else. I don't know where I am. But I knew that I was back that day in Cleary's, busy buying clothes so I could abandon and push down any feelings inside me that might surface. I went on to attend NA meetings because they include people with other addictions other than narcotics. And this really helped me to see addiction and to understand that it's in the mind. And I was able to pay off my debts and take control of it. Now, by that, I don't mean that it's gone, and sometimes if I'm in an area where there's shops, I feel that little impulse. It's almost like somebody pokes me somewhere in the body and I give a little jerk. But now I'm able to say, oh, well, that's that. And we can't go there, my love. We can't do that. We're just not going to do that today. It's a huge release. What really helped me also was the understanding that addiction is an answer to some unanswered turmoil, and I could recognize that in myself. There is a connection between dance, particularly a chaos type of dance, and shamanism. Now, shamanism has been practiced by every Indigenous society all over the world, including Ireland, and still is practiced today by many people. In shamanism, the shaman journeys to an altered state of consciousness to seek healing, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and maybe through meeting the ancestors if the healing that's needed is ancestral, to bring that healing back to the society that the shaman works with. So I came across the idea of shamanism through practicing the 5 rhythms, and I still had the headaches, and I was experiencing a lot of tiredness and a lot of difficulty. So I was still on my search for something to heal myself. So I decided to go to a shamanic workshop. I really enjoyed it, and without going into too much detail, I will say to you that I was able to journey myself very quickly and very easily. I then signed up for a shamanic practitioner's course, and it was during the time I was on that course that an opportunity came to go to a shamanic gathering in the Omega Center in upstate New York. So some of the people I went with, I was friends with and I knew well. And although it was difficult for me to undertake that journey, I went. The Omega Center is in a beautiful setting in woodlands in upstate New York. Now, just being there and meeting people who themselves may have been there looking for healing was inspirational on its own. But the first night we were there, we were introduced to all the shamans from South America, from Mongolia, Native Americans, African Americans. But for some reason, it was the woman from Mongolia who caught my attention. And when she started to speak, I felt a little ripple down my spine. So I took the opportunity to go to her for a private, well, it wasn't strictly private because so many people wanted to see her for healing that she took people in a group. So we sat in this large room on the floor in a group, and she sat at the head with her helper. And she would just look around the room, and her eyes would rest on someone. It seemed to be very spontaneous. It felt like she was almost being guided herself from within by her spirits, by her spirit guides. So after she had spoken with 2 or 3 people and done some healing with them, her eyes rested on me and she said, "What is going on there on the right side of your body?" So I went into my story, as I'm so good at blah, blah, blah. I'm in a lot of pain and I had a car accident, I have a whiplash injury and it hasn't got better. And she said, "No, what you have is a spirit intrusion." Now, I'd heard vaguely, but not done any kind of in-depth learning or reading into the matter, that spirits can attach to ourselves, the spirits of people we know who have died or family or whatever. But as I won't talk about that too much because I have very little knowledge of it really at that time. She invited me to lie down on the floor at the head of the room and she walked around me, tap, tap, tap. And as I've said to you, noise like music, dancing, drumming, repetitive noise is what allows the shaman to go into an altered state of consciousness, or which brings the shaman into an altered state of consciousness. So she's tap, tap, tapping around me and she said, "Did you ever have a miscarriage?" And I said, "No, but I had a baby who died at birth." She said, "Ah, I've got her." She said, "Our reincarnating soul has got lost and has attached itself to you." So she said, "What we're going to do is we're going to bring her in the spirit boat to the Bardo, where her reincarnating soul can be there for reincarnation." Now, I think I went into an I know I went into an altered state because I'm lying on the ground and suddenly I see the boat passing me on a river. It's usual for the person that the healing is being sought for not to travel in the spirit boat, for the other members of the shamanic group to do that. But I decided I was going to jump into the boat and I did. The next thing, I don't know how I'm holding the baby, but I'm not holding a baby that way, the way you would usually hold a baby. She's resting on my arms and my arms are in that position. The next place I'm in is I'm standing on the edge of a space that is completely filled with, I can only describe it as like a fog. It's kind of a misty. I'm looking into it and after what seemed like a couple of seconds, I don't know how long it was, I could see people in the distance rising up, 2 or 3 people, as if they were on an escalator. And then, very slowly, this figure emerged from this mist or fog. She was about 4 foot tall, dressed in white. She had silver grey hair cascading down from the top of her head over her body like a silver cloak. And she moved very slowly towards me. As she got near me and I saw her face, I saw that she was older than time itself. There wasn't a space on her face that wasn't a wrinkle. But out of that wrinkled face shone the pair of bluest eyes, blue, compassionate eyes looking at me. She reached out her hand in the same shape as mine, and I reached forward and put the baby into her arms, and she disappeared as slowly as she had come back into the mist. I'm minded of the words of John Denver, "And the Spirit fills the darkness of the heavens. It fills the endless yearning of the soul. It lives within a star too far to dream of. It lives within each part and is the whole. It's the fire and the wings that fly us home. I had exactly the same feeling that when I said it the first time. How was that, Keen?
Beautiful.
Yeah, I just got into a complete flow with it.
When you're in the flow, you're what would you call it? Riffing. Is that the word to say? You were riffing there.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, I actually couldn't stop.
Yeah.
You know, because, do you know, it took me a long time to realise that with the tapping of her stick, that I had entered into an altered state of consciousness, because otherwise that was a shamanic journey for me.
Did you take ayahuasca on that trip? Or
No,
that was completely
I've
separate?
never
So
taken ayahuasca.
They done all, that was all sound.
Yeah. So what changed? Did anything change? Well, yes and no. I still had the headaches. They didn't miraculously disappear. But what did change was the huge level of terror and anxiety that accompanied them. Now, I know now that anxiety often accompanies chronic pain, because there is a huge anxiety around just having the pain. So it seemed like I came into that space, you know, but I was able to get to a space where when that feeling of anxiety would start, I would say, sure, it's a headache. Like, you know, you're not going to die from a headache. It's a headache. And this freedom from the terror allowed me, I suppose, to think more rationally about it. So I started remembering what the neurologist said that I had a pain pattern. So I thought, well, yes, the emotional reason and the psychological reasons have been healed, but physically the pain pattern is still there in my brain. What I did next was I took about, well, I was uncertain at the time, but I started off by saying a couple of months, that I would take a couple of months off and I would really focus on healing that headache. I told my friends that my phone was going to be off or on silent, and if they wanted to contact me or needed to speak to me, to text me and I would ring them back. Now, what this was important, because often I'd be going out to meet someone for lunch or something, and if I felt a headache starting, I would get into a panic. Oh my God, now the headache's going to start. And when I'd be going out, have I got my medication? Have I got this? Have I got that? You know, I need a cup of coffee to stop this, to take a cup of coffee with the medication to really accelerate the action of the painkiller. So, but by taking this time off, it meant that whenever I felt a headache starting, I could actually stop whatever I was doing, ironing the clothes, cooking the dinner, sit down, take a breath, be quiet, soothe the anxiety around it by saying to myself, it's a pain pattern, it's pain, that's all it is. There's nothing else going on. I did a little bit of research on Google and discovered that the part of the brain that stores traumatic or painful experiences is the amygdala near the base of the skull. So I would do things like put my hands there and say, it's okay, calm down. I'd breathe into that part of my brain. And slowly, over time, the headaches started to subside. Now, I was back in the world talking to people, and I still was having some headaches, but mostly I was waking up with them in the morning. But again, slowly over time, not taking medication. If I did wake up with a headache, instead of taking medication, I would sit up, I would breathe, I would focus on the pain, I would focus on that part of my brain. And the other thing I did was I developed this little mantra for myself, because part of the terror that I had previously was around not being safe, not being secure, not being loved, being on my own. So I started to say, just going around, not just at first when the pain would be starting to happen, but then just whatever I was doing, I would just say, I am safe, secure, and loved. And you know, that came to be true. I feel very safe, secure, and loved. And I feel loved by the universe because as part of my stopping work, I was obliged to sell my house. I couldn't pay my mortgage. I went to live with my sister, then I lived with a friend. The council very kindly provided me with a beautiful apartment to live in for a very reasonable, affordable rent. And the day I walked into the living room, the sun was shining in the window. And I thought, I am loved. Somebody out there, God, Spirit, the universe. And I still feel that very much inside myself today. And it's what sustains me. So thank you, God. And so it is. I wanted to say something just as an afterthought. And the first thing I want to say is that Irish society has changed so phenomenally since 60 years ago when I was in that situation. But I want to also say what I feel was such a huge suppression of women. I mean, the government figures say that there was 50,000 women went through that system between 1922 and I can't remember now the year that it ended, but it was quite late on. I actually believe that there was far more women than that. And the reason for suppressing and criminalizing women really was the ideology of the Catholic Church and its ban on sex before marriage, which was somehow incorporated into the minds of society in this country. I'm also prompted to ask the question, where were all the unmarried fathers? I would love for just one man, to step forward and tell his story about how he allowed that to happen to the woman who was the mother of his child and whatever happened to his child. I want to finish by saying that my belief is that we are all born with a soul, an aspect of the divine, and that we have a yearning to return to that divinity. And I think Paramasana Yoga Nanda says it beautiful, and I'll read what he says because I don't want to misquote him. He's referring to the historical battle portrayed in the Bhagavad Gita. He says it's an allegory for the inner conflict between man's base materialistic instincts and his innate yearning to attain blissful spiritual consciousness of oneness with the divine. I know that yearning. I experienced it as a child singing in the choir. I've experienced it briefly from time to time. I suppose they are what I would call just moments of awakening. I believe that we are all drawn unconsciously to situations in our lives that help us to grow in awareness and consciousness and to return to that spiritual union or yoga. Now that you've heard my whole story, I hope that it has inspired you in some way to continue your own healing or to maybe commence your healing. If you would like to leave me a comment, you can do so below. In either event, thank you for listening. I wish you well and God bless you.